Hello, everyone. Welcome to TLGS 2022. My name is Elaine Walker. I'm the Graduate Studies Librarian at Mississippi University for Women. I'll be collecting questions in the chat for this session, which is Librarians as Mentors, a student-centered approach to graduate training. And with that, I'll let you guys take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome. We're so excited to be here. Welcome to our panel entitled Librarians as Mentors, a Student-Centered Approach to Graduate Training, as was just said. My name is Erica Bruchko. I'm the librarian for U.S. History and African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. And I'm joined by two fellow history librarian colleagues with whom I've worked with for many years, Chella Vaidyanathan, the European World History and Philosophy librarian, who's also at Emory, and Scott Libson, the librarian for History, Jewish Studies, Religious Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. Before we begin our discussion of librarians as mentors, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous land upon which we live and work and the labor that built our institutions. So if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read this land and labor acknowledgement. As members of the Emory and Indiana University communities, we respectfully acknowledge that the territory our institutions occupy are the true ancestral and unceded homelands of the Chickasaw, Cherokee, Muskogee, Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people. We wish to elevate the diverse histories and cultures that have experienced erasure, violence, and oppression as a result of white supremacy. And as we gather in this virtual space, we invite you to share the names of the Indigenous people who lived and continue to live on the land where you reside and work. And Chella's going to put a link to native land in the chat if you'd like to explore that. We mourn the loss of life and liberty of the millions of enslaved people whose labor has contributed to the great wealth of this nation and our institutions. And we acknowledge the long-lasting impact on Black communities and commit ourselves to the work of justice for our colleagues, friends, and fellow citizens. Thanks very much. All right. Now on to today's agenda and our objectives. So as I mentioned, this panel is drawn from our shared experiencing mentoring graduate students as subject librarians over about the past 7 years or so at Emory in Indiana. And during this time, our own graduate and professional careers have intersected. And as a result, we've really developed a shared interest in exploring the relationship between academic libraries and graduate students interested in library and library adjacent careers. And we're going to talk about what that means. Together, we've come to believe the following, which will be reiterated throughout the presentation. One, that for the benefits of students and the profession, mentoring must be student-centered. This might sound quite obvious, but we've tried to articulate what this means. We think it should recognize the really multifaceted nature of graduate education and pay special attention to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In addition, we've come to the realization that as information professionals, we're actually very well positioned to provide both ad hoc and more formal programmatic support for students, and that both of these approaches are quite valid. We recognize that the road to librarianship is quite circuitous for many, maybe for many of you as well. But we advocate that librarians identify some common goals in order to try to provide some clearer pathways to the profession. So onto our agenda. As you'll see on this slide, we'll begin with some definitions and a short literature review before turning to a series of case studies, an assessment of gaps, and some final takeaways. We have some lofty goals. At the end of the session, we hope that you'll be able to do the following: to assess various mentorship opportunities within the profession that we lay out and others, to brainstorm avenues where you might get involved in these efforts, and to better understand the unique role that we play as librarians in helping these students develop career paths. And we've been so pleased that so many of the other presentations over the course of the past day and a half have really spoken to this directly and indirectly. More tangibly, you'll take some resources and documentation with you, which we'll be distributing, and a series of questions to help you develop a plan for creating a student-centered mentoring program. So with that in mind, I'll turn things over to Scott, who's going to provide a framework for our discussions.
Thank you, Erica. Since our presentation addresses mentorship, we felt it was important to start with some representative definitions of the term that we found in the course of our literature review. So the first you'll see here is from the Ohio State University Protege Toolkit. A mentor is an expert who provides wisdom and guidance based on his or her own experience. Like coaching, mentoring focuses on solutions rather than problems. There is more telling in mentoring than in coaching, since the mentor serves as an advisor and guide. The second here is from Rockham Graduate School at the University of Michigan. The role of a mentor in graduate education is to teach, sponsor, encourage, counsel, and befriend a less skilled or less experienced person for the purpose of promoting the latter's professional and/or personal development. We chose these two definitions because of Ohio State's reference to coaching and Rockham's noting that the purpose centers on the mentee, though I would note that there's lots of definitions of mentoring out there, some of which conflict pretty greatly with one another. Our literature review focused on keywords related to mentorship, librarianship, and graduate students. It revealed a rich body of scholarship that I encourage you to explore yourself. We categorized the literature into three areas of emphasis: works focusing on how librarians mentor LIS students, works about how teaching faculty can mentor graduate students in general, which often did not refer to librarians at all, but which could have applied to faculty teaching LIS students. And finally, works on how libraries and librarians can better support graduate students. The latter category owes a great deal to the TLGS conferences, and we've heard more about that today and yesterday. Much of that scholarship centered on designing spaces for graduate students, helping graduate student professionalization through things like 3-minute theses or ORCID IDs or the like, and finding ways to improve graduate student research through workshops, better cooperation between libraries and departments, hiring graduate students, helping graduate students with literature reviews, and that sort of thing. We found surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, little on librarians' role in mentoring non-LIS students. Addressing that lacuna is one of the reasons for our presentation today. Nevertheless, there were some important takeaways from the literature that inform what we're about to say. First, and perhaps most generally, graduate students benefit from mentoring. They are at a particularly vulnerable point in their lives, spending time and money on a degree that may or may not be leading to a job. They might be living in a new place, perhaps far from family and friends. For PhD students, there are massive opportunity costs for a 5 to 8 year degree during a person's young adulthood. And as the students near the end of the program, they are often increasingly isolated, researching and writing on their own, which is something that Amy just spoke about. For disadvantaged and underrepresented populations, the challenges are magnified by structural and cultural factors, including graduate school norms that give greater cultural capital to white, wealthy, cisgender men. Second, there are many types of mentoring out there, and they are conceived in a wide variety of ways. Scholars have thought about how the traditional, formal, one-to-one mentorship that has the specific goal, of advancing the mentee's career has benefits and drawbacks, and they've suggested various ways of addressing its limitations. We will be centering our discussion around formal structures of mentoring and informal mentoring relationships. But in general, we found that the best conceptions of mentoring place an emphasis on the mentee and their needs, hopes, and circumstances. And that leads to our third and final takeaway, which is that the need to take an individualized approach to mentoring, what Julie James, Ashley Rayner, and Jeanette Bruno call whole person mentoring. Because each mentee has their own needs, hopes, and circumstances, no one model of mentorship will work for everyone, and we encourage you to adapt whatever you take away from our talk today to the particular circumstances of the person you are mentoring, and also to think critically about your own positionality. To briefly discuss some of that positionality, we three are subject librarians. Of course, there are many library professions out there, subject librarianship just being one of them. As subject librarians, the three of us have experience mentoring undergraduate students, LIS students, PhD students, and librarians, library staff. Just as there are many other library professions out there, librarians might mentor people in any number of other circumstances, including high school students, graduate students in other terminal MA programs, or individuals who are not students or library employees at all. Given the focus of this conference, we'll be focusing today on LIS students and PhD students in the humanities or social sciences, most of whom are interested in subject librarianship. Of course, our positionality is not limited to our jobs or the jobs we are seeking. Both the mentors and the mentees have intersectional identities and individual backgrounds that will have shaped and will continue to shape their perspectives and experience. It is incumbent on the mentor, both parties in the case of co-mentorship, to acknowledge their limited perspective and to recognize and advocate for underrepresented groups within the profession. And now I'll turn it over to Chella to talk a little bit about mentoring gaps and librarian roles.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will be addressing the main crux of the presentation, which is mentoring gaps, and then the roles that librarians, not only subject librarians, everybody can play in addressing some of these gaps. So before we get to that point, I would like to first mention that a lot of the mentoring programs that, as you know, are being offered by the departments and I'm sure career centers that you have on your campuses, they all focus on very specific areas or aspects pertinent, to the mentoring programs that they already have. So what happens is that there are multiple mentoring programs on campus. However, they all sort of siloed, they exist in their own spaces, but they really don't sort of connect or flow well with each other. Hence, what happens with that sort of approach is that graduate students often encounter gaps that neither of the Career Center one or the departmental program specifically address. So that's one of the reasons that they do often come to the subject librarians or maybe librarians in other departments and talk to us or talk to other colleagues to have their concerns addressed. And some of these, again, include really a broad range of skill sets or other kinds of activities like, negotiating salary and benefits. How can they develop lifelong learning skills? How to go about gaining sort of work-life balance or mastering research skills, or even questions about like, what if in case they're not interested in pursuing a career as a professor, but they are interested in alternative careers and they really don't know what those careers are. So those are some of the reasons that graduate students, they definitely feel a lot more comfortable sharing these concerns and then having us as sounding boards, talking these things out with us because they know that they're not being judged and they feel safe and comfortable talking with us. So what can librarians do in these cases? Librarians can definitely play a very important role in these scenarios by acting as mediators between these different groups, right? So we have these various stakeholder groups. What we could do is we could act as mediators and help them to think of conceptualizing a very holistic program that at least, of course, not all gaps can be addressed, but at least to the extent possible, address most of these gaps. So on to the next slide. What we are going to do now is share some case studies of formal mentorship programs. So I will go ahead and start with the Rusa History and the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association. So these are two programs that I've been participating for the past 2.5 years. The Rusa History section offers a formalized structured mentoring program. This was designed and created by the Academic Librarians Committee. And they have put together a curriculum that not only addresses how to go about seeking jobs, but also sort of like addressing the nitty-gritty day-to-day daily responsibilities about what subject librarians would be doing. So it is perfect both for the LIS students as well as the early career librarians. So in that case, I have mentored both LIS student as well as an early career library professional to the program, helping them learn about how to go through approval plans, how to teach an instruction session, or how they can actually go about, doing the day-to-day job responsibilities, right? So that kind of thing. And the other things they're interested in, obviously, is how to network, how to present at conferences, how to be active in committee work. Again, this is a curriculum that's specifically put together by our colleagues in the mentoring program subcommittee, which has received a lot of positive feedback from folks who have participated, both as mentors as well as mentees. The other one that I have also participated is the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association program, which is particularly geared towards members who are the Asian Pacific, heritage, and they come together and partner mentors and mentees, sort of broadly based on interests. So generally, these groups, mentoring groups, we talk about issues related to social justice, DEI, and other areas as relevant. Usually the mentees and mentors meet first meeting, the mentees have specific goals, and after we set up goals, we try our best to address these goals. In some cases, there may be a perfect alignment. In some cases, there may not be. So in my case, I've mentored, for instance, one colleague was working technical services, right? But the person who I mentored was very much interested in DEI, social justice related issues. So we watched webinars together. We talked about articles discussing those kinds of issues. But again, some of the things are more general, where in case they wanted to be more involved in professional association. So I helped them to kind of brainstorm, see how they could go about doing that, how to write an article, and how to serve on committees. And often it also got into sort of areas where I would look at their cover letters or CVs or format their resume if they're applying for jobs or internships. So those are some ways where I have worked very closely with the Apollo mentorship program. So we'll move on to talk about the Woodruff Fellowship program at Emory University, and my colleague Erica Bruchko will provide an overview of it.
Yeah, so as we kind of explore the landscape of some of the different mentoring opportunities, we're going to shift gears a little bit. The Woodruff Fellowship at Emory University is different from the professional associations that Chella talked about, and instead is really geared towards PhD or doctoral students. Many of you may have similar programs at your institutions, but basically it places latter career PhD candidates in various positions in the library. They complete 20 hours a week, and then are also intended to write and complete their dissertations. Although it is technically a completion fellowship, however, PhDs who are in these fellowships have used this as a stepping stone to both create the connections that we're talking about through mentorship, and also gain useful experience. And we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between kind of internship experiencing and mentoring, but we're also very happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So I think one of the reasons that the program is so successful is that there are great pains taken to match student skills with projects that are useful for the library. And as such, it's a way for students to kind of explore what they may be good at and how they might contribute. In addition, they're also invited to develop skills that they may be lacking. Several of our fellows have explored or acquired new digital scholarship skills or done bibliographic work that they hadn't done before. And they're also invited to participate in the library culture more broadly. So kind of getting to know the bureaucracy of libraries and being able to speak that is something that they really acquire through this mentorship. So Chella is going to be talking about two individuals that she's mentored recently, and how they've parlayed what they've learned into careers. So Chella?
Thank you, Erica. So two of the Woodruff Fellows that I mentored they both are from the history department. So the first year I had somebody who worked on a variety of projects, as Erica already mentioned. He selected projects that closely aligned with his subject expertise, where he could also contribute in a meaningful way. So the very first semester, he worked very closely with our sociology subject librarian, and both of them co-wrote a applied for a small grant targeting first generation students to do an oral history project, which again, who knew, right? That actually turned out to be a phenomenally successful program, and it was well received. And he also worked on other programs like collection development, he put together a guide. Anyway, there were a wide range of other things that he worked on. But this was something that he really fell in love with, and he was very passionate about it. It was well received, as I said. And he developed unique skill sets as somebody who coordinated and participated in the program. And as he was very much interested in it, he eventually ended up getting a position as an oral history coordinator within the Emory University Library. So he's working in Rose Library, Special Collections Library. So again, this turned out to be wonderful. He just stepped into the fellowship and, with sort of like an open mind and approached the projects, and he found something that just spoke to his career interest. Next was another Woodruff Fellow from the history department as well, who worked on some collection development projects. Erica and I jointly co-managed and co-supervised as well as co-mentored him. And he taught numerous instruction sessions with us. He collaborated with other special collections libraries on campus. We have special collections health sciences as well as the Pitt's Theology Library. So that's something, again, he helped us and bring together those collaborative efforts, research materials, put together instruction guides for us. He also worked with the humanities subject librarians, the team as a whole, to design a physical as well as virtual exhibit on environmental humanities. So again, he worked on a wide variety of projects, and he was interested in pursuing a career, looking for careers besides professoriate, and he did get a job with federal government. So again, those two turned out to be really fruitful relationships, and we were very happy that both of them found opportunities that they really enjoyed working in. And next, my colleague will talk about the AHA program.
Yes, and just to piggyback on what Chella was saying, I was also a Woodruff Fellow and found my path to librarianship that way. So the American Historical Association, if we switch gears to some professional organizations outside of the field of librarianship, the Career Contacts Program, it was launched in 2015 as part of a Career Diversity for Historians initiative, and it connects current PhD students, which they call junior contacts, with history PhDs, senior contacts, who are working outside of the professoriate. So their core purpose is to set up informational interviews and really form that, help facilitate those connections. And then beyond that, mentors and mentees meet several times, talk about the transition outside of to work outside of the professoriate. They offer feedback on professional materials and just help develop their professional identities. I've participated in the program for 1 year. I'm at the very early stages, so we've just met once, but it has been interesting. This is a student who is working in a library, but also pursuing a PhD at the same time. And I've answered questions about being a librarian at a research intensive university, which is something that he aspires to, and it's been a very fruitful partnership so far, limited but fruitful. And so now Scott's going to talk a little bit more about library and information science mentorship and some other avenues of mentorship. Scott.
Thanks, Erica.
Yeah.
Like many of you, I work at an institution with a highly regarded library and information science programs. The Indiana University Libraries and the Department of Information and Library Science here, which we call DILS, for many years, they've benefited from each other. Librarians teach many of the DILS courses, and we hire DILS students to do much of the essential work of the libraries. The students gain useful experience while we gain invested workers who often know more about some aspects of librarianship than the full-timers. This partnership creates many opportunities for mentorship, but I want to talk about the most formal incarnation of it, which is a class called Z605. It's an internship course, and it's a foundational requirement for the MLS degree. I've personally only supervised one intern since I was hired in 2018. So I'm going to talk about that experience, but I've discussed the program with my colleagues to make sure that my experiences were not unusual. So an MLS student emailed to me in the fall of 2020 to find out more about Jewish Studies librarianship, which is one of my areas. Our relationship thus began in a sort of informal mentorship capacity. She brought up the possibility of an internship during that first meeting, but I was reluctant to pursue it unless we could pay her for her labor, and there's no built-in funding for the internship. I would argue that a student-centered approach to mentoring demands that students be paid for their labor, and I appreciated Ben's comments yesterday that made a similar point with regard to Notre Dame's Digital Scholarship Fellowship. We eventually found money to pay the student, and so she was my Jewish Studies intern in the spring of 2021. In keeping with the student-centered approach, I asked the student to design a project that addressed the question, what would help you get a job? The only requirement that I gave her was that it include some sort of shareable output, again, to help with the job search. She decided to create a LibGuide, and eventually she created 2 of them. Our weekly meetings addressed both the creation of the LibGuides and the job search. Regarding the LibGuide, we mainly discussed how the guide can help her build a transferable skill set and how it raised issues of information organization that she might later encounter. To keep the focus on her future career, we reserved time each week to talk about what jobs she had come across, what was meant by certain terms in the position descriptions, and what other training might have been helpful. An example of that is that at some point in the semester, I changed my reference consultation form to ask whether the people seeking the reference consultations would be willing to have her sit in on the meetings, because reference consultations was something she felt like would be beneficial for her. It was also important to me that the LibGuide identified her as the creator. Her new employer specifically mentioned the LibGuide as evidence that she would be a good librarian. So in summary, this formal mentoring relationship was facilitated by an existing structure that forced us to have certain objectives, but within that, there was still room to center the work on the student. The final category of formal mentorship that we would like to talk about today are those that stem from academic departments' professionalization seminars. I'm going to be talking specifically about the seminar through Emory University's history department, but similar programs exist elsewhere. I'm an Emory grad, and I participated in this seminar as a student in 2016, 2017, and then was asked, along with Erica, to share our experiences as librarians last year. The seminar has a number of limitations, which are known to the professors who lead the seminar, and which became even clearer to me as a student. It's a year-long program during a student's final year that focuses on professorial jobs in the fall and other types of work in the spring. So in other words, the other types of work are really at the last possible moment. During the professorial section, students workshop cover letters, CVs, elevator pitches, interviews, and then they do a mock job talk, that sort of thing. In the spring, the focus shifts to learning about other careers and translating the PhD for people who presumably do not understand its value. So there's a number of problems with that approach, but those structural limitations are ameliorated in my experience by the extraordinarily generous, aware, and open-minded faculty who have led the seminar in the past. I graduated from Emory in the middle of the professionalization seminar. So when Chella and Erica visited the seminar, I had actually already graduated and was actively looking for work. This may have been my first time meeting Chella, though Erica and I had known each other for a number of years. One of the main benefits of the seminar then, and of formal mentorship in general, was to build a connection that otherwise might not have existed. The mediation of the faculty member leading the seminar was key. And in this case, it did not take away from centering the student. One consequence of timing the seminar so that it's at the very end of the student's career perhaps inadvertently makes it a little bit more student-centered. There's no time to gain any new training or skills or anything before going on the job market. You're kind of at that point already. So Chella and Erica had to take each of us as we were and help determine what careers in libraries we each might have been prepared for. I had fortunately been thinking about this for a long time and had already been working in special collections, access services, digital humanities. So I had a lot of experience at that point already. Following the seminar, because of this new relationship and her knowledge of my individual circumstances, Chella regularly sent me job postings. And as I applied for jobs, Erica and Chella both assisted me with cover letters, resumes, interview preparation, campus visit prep, and job negotiations. Being asked to participate in the program as a librarian allowed me to share my experiences as a former student, what skills I continued to use in my work, what I wasn't prepared for, and what I liked or disliked about my career. The position of being an invited guest also allowed for some ability to shape the seminar. I asked that the session be open to all students, not just those in their final year, which the professor leading the seminar was actually planning to do already. Unfortunately, none of those students actually attended. Only the students who had been participating in the seminar were there. But in any case, it was a good opportunity missed for those students who did not actually attend. In summary, professionalization seminars can facilitate a student-centered approach by mentoring by bringing librarians into contact with students they might not otherwise encounter. Although we sometimes bristle at the alt-ac and non-academic labels, being so categorized, as was essentially the case at Emory, allowed us into a room to tell people about our rewarding careers where we make use of our history PhDs literally every single day. So now I'm going to turn to informal mentoring. Some studies have shown that informal mentoring is significantly more common in libraries than formal mentoring, which makes sense given the value mentees place on flexible, ad hoc advising with people whom they might not want to be meeting with on a regular basis for a variety of reasons. Our theme for this portion of the presentation is that where formal mentoring won't work or where the mentee doesn't want it to work, a student-centered approach should allow them to find an informal mentor. I will be talking specifically about the relationship side of informal mentoring. Chella will talk about the value of on-the-spot ad hoc mentoring, and Erica will talk about how informal mentoring can offer an outlet for students at a vulnerable moment in their lives. My informal mentoring experiences often arise when someone learns that I'm a subject librarian who lacks an MLS or MIS degree. In consequence, the discussion is sometimes spur of the moment, such as the one I had a few weeks ago when I was in the middle of a reference consultation. The student was asking about my background and how I got my current job, which led to a lengthy conversation about the lives of recently graduated PhDs and the politics in academic departments if that recent graduate does land a tenure-track job as a teaching professor. I always prefer for these conversations to occur early in a PhD student's studies so that the mentoring relationship has room to grow, so the student can consider how to best prepare themselves for the job market. And so I can be a little more honest about what they ought to do to be competitive on the job market. Often, though, these conversations occur later in a graduate student's studies. Again, they tend to come to me because they recognize their situation in my own. One history PhD student from IU, for instance, had a lengthy background in digital humanities, but no MLS degree, and was considering both professorial and academic library jobs, both probably associated with digital humanities in some capacity. We talked about his background and hopes for the immediate and longer term future and how one might lead to the other. Then, since we did have similar interests and backgrounds, we kept up the conversations, usually at a restaurant or bar and rarely talking exclusively about jobs. In both of these cases, the students were looking for someone to fill in some gaps in their existing mentoring relationships. They had advisors and other formal mentors who could help them in many ways, but the informal mentoring offered them a more complete picture of what their future might look like. And now I'd like to turn it over to Chella to talk a little bit more about her experiences with informal mentoring.
Thank you, Scott. So in my case, as Scott has already talked about, mentioned that I'll be mainly talking about ad hoc mentoring. And I will mention both the cases of where I did that for graduate students as well as for our library staff members who were at that time thinking about applying to library schools or were already in library schools. So first, to go with a graduate student, so I did encounter one with a humanities PhD, was about a few months away from finishing up this program. And one of my colleagues referred him to me, and he was really interested in learning about how he can identify what are transferable skills from his CV. So he brought a copy of it to me, and I spent some time already before even meeting with him looking at it, just to see what are some additional skills he has that could easily translate into for a career, let's say, as a curator of rare books or as a subject librarian. So then we met informally for coffee, and I chatted with him and got to know about that he was very open to all kinds of career, not just professors, which is really nice. And then we talked about what were transferable skills, how he could reformat his CV again to suit the kinds of job ads that he was interested in applying for. So that's one example, very specific, where he had a need and he wanted to be able to talk with somebody who could help him do that. So that was just actually only one meeting with that student. So very specific information needed at that point of time. Another one was sort of something that happened by chance. We currently have a philosophy PhD student who has been working in the libraries with us, with subject librarians for about 3 years. So what happened was I had gone to his to the Graduate Association, to the Philosophy Graduate Association, to be able to give a talk in general about library services to graduate students. And he was in that meeting. And after presenting about library services for graduate students, I talked a little bit about alternative careers and subject librarianship. So as soon as the presentation was over, he came up and spoke with me. And later on, he followed up with an email and asked what, of course, in this case, as Scott already had work experience in the libraries, he also had been working in the libraries for quite some time. So he did say that I would really be interested in pursuing a career as subject librarian and what would I be able to do. So then he applied for some positions that we had open, and then gradually he started working for us, and now he's one of our Woodrow Fellows. So it just turned out to be really helpful. And again, in his case, it was very ad hoc. Again, we have been meeting on and off, I would say a few times, not consistently, and we don't have formal mentoring. It's very informal. It's more like whenever there's an information need, we would meet, or occasionally I would come across job ads that might be helpful for him, and I would forward that to him. So that's the case of students. And I would also like to specifically mention library staff members, whom I have been working with colleagues closely at the reference desk or any other service point. So when I learned about the fact that they're applying to the library school or they're already in the program, so in that case, if they had a specific need for information or request for information about scholarships or internship opportunities that are available for them, so I've shared that information. Occasionally, I've looked at their cover letters, CVs, or served as a reference. So those are some ways. Again, there's a very specific need for information. Again, it's very informal, ad hoc, nothing that we have decided before, just like a chance encounter. We started talking, and then we went ahead and had that conversation and helped that person out. So next, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Erica Bruchko, who will be talking about her experience. And I apologize, I heard that there was some noise disturbances. Hopefully that they were gone. So give it to Erica.
They did.
Thanks.
So in my experience doing some of this informal mentorship, as Scott mentioned, students are at a very vulnerable part of their graduate career. They're often at a crossroads, and this is kind of where some of the student centering approaches come in. They often realize that they don't want to be part of the professoriate. This was recently the case with a second-year PhD student in history that came to me. For latter career graduate students, sometimes they express to me that they feel crushed by the weight of the academic job market and the realization that they're unwilling to really make the requisite personal and financial sacrifices to be a professor. And as Scott was saying, kind of the costs of going through graduate school and coming to this realization at a certain point can often be quite a heavy thing for graduate students. In many of these cases, as I mentioned, there's an emotional dimension to these meetings, especially if they're considering dropping out of a program, or for later career graduate students, they feel like they're a failure due to the expectations set by their departmental advisors. So I bring this all up because in this way, I think the informality of these relationships is actually quite good and necessary. Students often feel like they're able to speak freely outside of the confines of departmental settings. And Scott alluded to this, by going out for drinks, or in my case, going out for coffee. And it's been interesting to me that many of these students who are really acculturated to the demands of academia within the department are often really surprised at the open and generous nature or willingness of librarians to help them. So I think this flexibility allows us to tackle some really important challenges that we've alluded to throughout the presentation. Many of these students, and again, because we don't have an LIS school, these are generally doctoral seeking students that, in my case, many are very well suited for various library careers, but they don't recognize the diverse skill set that they've acquired as a PhD student. And they're certainly unable to articulate these skills. And when we think about all of the programs that we've discussed over the course of this conference, these are some of the things that they don't feel comfortable with, even if they have learned to do. So research skills, work with databases, understanding digital collections and metadata, they really feel uncomfortable stressing these skills because they haven't been valued, frankly, often within their departments. Within these informal meetings, I've also found that they've provided an opportunity for them to ask me frankly about some of the language of the profession, and Chella alluded to that as well, interpreting job ads and jargon, and which we all know the library has much of. We also discuss the ways that they can acquire experience, whether it's via shadowing or work within their classrooms, exhibit creation that might appeal both within the professoriate and within library professional jobs. So just in sum, these meetings really provide a conduit for moving forward, regardless of the path they ultimately choose, an emotional outlet, again, a touchstone outside of their academic departments, as well as it leading to some concrete steps that they can take. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chella.
Thank you, Erica. I hope it's better. I took off my earpods so that there won't be any more disturbances. So, in our previous slide, I did talk about librarians working as mediators. So what would be a good point for librarians to sort of, again, intervene in these areas? So with this one, it's specifically going to address a need for a programmatic awareness on the part of the different parties or stakeholders involved, so that they are aware that graduate students have these very specific needs and there are gaps, so they can come together and have some meaningful conversations on sort of designing the program. Now, just like to put this out there, when I say programmatic awareness or need for a program, doesn't mean that we are advocating one kind of mentorship or the other. We all three of us do think, and we had a discussion about it, about how informal as well as formal mentorship inform each other and vice versa, and that there are benefits to both. So obviously we're not saying that formal mentorship is the way to go. We still see that there are lots of areas where informal and formal mentorship that exist side by side. I think what we are arguing for is sort of having that awareness so that even with those programs that are designed by the departments as well as by the career centers, they approach it in a more holistic manner with some common goals that's specific to the areas, and then go from there so that the programs can at least talk to one another, right? Or the program directors can talk to one another. So where can librarians play a role? I think what librarians can do at this point of time is bring these different stakeholder groups together, maybe even the graduate students too, and initiate discussions about what kind of program would be helpful for them. What are the programs already addressing? Where are the gaps? So again, at least all the parties are involved in this conversation together, and then they realize where it's beneficial to have maybe more information or change particular aspects of the program, those kinds of things. So how can they go about doing this, right? So it's helpful to have sort of a strategy and a very formal approach to it, because that way it's helpful to gain useful feedback from graduate students. Obviously, we mentioned, Scott had brought this several times, as well as Erica, about having a student-centered approach. So not necessarily just looking at things from more a departmental career center perspective, but also looking at things from a student-centered perspective. So conducting a survey and this is obviously, it's not a one-time survey done and dealt with. This is something that one would have to be working throughout. So they would have to conduct a survey, understand the needs of the students, and talk with them, really need, identify where are the gaps that are in these programs. And then once we have that information, again, that's something that has to be done every single year because the cohort varies, the needs vary. As you know, job situation changes, the market changes. So I think that's something that has to be done every year. And once they have an idea of the gaps, then the departments or the career centers can actually work on their own or come together and have some conversation about who can address what and design a program over that. So that way, if they do have a strategy like that and they approach it in a systematic manner, what would end up happening is that they can have a really wonderful holistic approach to mentoring itself that would lend itself to being beneficial to our graduate students. And while they're doing that, obviously graduate students are not just local students, there are some international students, there are students of color, so LGBTQ students. So I think it's really important as they're having these conversations also to kind of have a very inclusive DEI, social justice focused approach, as they are, again, different folks will have different needs, to integrate that as well while they are doing this, doing the designing of the program itself. And as far as graduate students is concerned, I think it's very important for us to provide them with a self-appraisal tool so that the students can look at their CV. And again, we do this when we meet with them, but I think it's also helpful for the students to have some sort of an appraisal tool beforehand so that they can work on areas or skill sets, what they already have gained, and list them, and then see where they need to have additional skill sets, how they can develop, because that way they can clearly identify a path about which direction they can take. So what can librarians do besides bringing these different stakeholder groups together, right? What we could do is obviously offer research skills. So in this case, we can offer to research relevant resources that's available out there. And we have several institutions that have very generously shared various toolkits, shared the entire program, again, handouts, so many of them are out there. So what we could offer to do is we could offer to collect all of these together, offer to collect the checklist together, and then share these with the career centers, with the faculty, and with the graduate students. And then this would be really helpful as they're going about designing this program. So again, so that way they will have the formal mentorship programs as well as the informal ones sort of walking hand in hand, side by side, to enrich the experiences of our graduate students. So moving on to, as we are talking about checklists and other resources, so all three of us have compiled a LibGuide with useful resources that has, again, full-scale curricula to develop a specific area of expertise. We have gathered checklists, timelines, self-appraisal tools, all of that is included in the guide. And again, I would also like to mention, if you have suggestions for other resources that we could include in the LibGuide, we welcome that. Please do reach out to us, let us know. And if you end up consulting these or using this, we would also be very, very interested in learning from you on how you use this. And we would love to have any feedback that you would like to provide us as we move forward with our own programs as well. So, and we have a list of suggested resources as well as a long bibliography that we had put together. That's also on the list. So moving on to the next slide. There we have, but there's a lot, and there's also a 3-volume set that had recently been published. So there's a lot out there once you start looking for it, but not necessarily focusing on librarians, but very few librarians compared to other kinds of mentoring relationships. So not a big surprise. So we welcome your question and answers, and we would love to hear from you now. Thank you very much for coming to this presentation and listening to our talk. Questions? And we do have our contact information up there too. So if you have any specific questions for any of us, feel free to reach out to us via email. So.
Yeah, Wendy mentioned that ACRL has a mentoring program, and she shares that with new librarians. I think sharing information is a great first start. But yeah, it is hard. The connecting piece can be a challenge. Finding and getting beyond this serendipity that seems to be at the base of so many of the interactions that we've had. And Wendy also mentions that, some of this inadvertent mentoring. Thank you. Other questions or comments, or folks who might want to share some of the work that they've done for the larger group?
Yes, please do. We would love to hear from you. So if you have any experience, I'm sure you do, informally and formally as well, please do. We would love to hear more from you as well. Oh, Stacy, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's something that we find ourselves doing quite a lot of, and we're trying to think through what that means and how we can do it better.
Why you?
Yeah, and thank you to Brittany. Just a shout out to Brittany O'Neill, who is one of the authors, I believe, of the RUSA history curriculum, which is really excellent and well thought out and structured in the right way. So thank you, Brittany.
Yeah, and so well designed, honestly. I highly recommend, if you have not seen it, please reach out to Brittany. And I will say this for other groups that I'm involved in. I've reached out to Brittany and Amanda so many times to ask if I could share the curriculum with other programs that's just starting a mentoring program. And they've all been very pleased about how beautifully it has been structured and how they've put thought into every single aspect, right from job search to day-to-day job responsibilities and community service. Anything you can think of, they've done a phenomenal job. So please reach out to them.
Yeah. And Wendy brings up regarding formal mentoring and sometimes the lack of recognition that maybe librarians get. I think that's one of the things you may have been getting at, Wendy, compared to faculty. And that is something that Chella was trying to get at in the gaps, right? Like, we're doing this work, and sometimes because of its informality or because of the silos within the university, it doesn't get the recognition it needs. And as far as kind of going to conferences, that is something that we've talked about. And I know Chella has invited graduate students to conferences before, but there are costs to that. I hope I'm getting at your comment accurately, Wendy.
Yeah, one of the aspects of the recent 3-volume book on mentoring, on academic mentoring, that was released from ACRL or ALA, is the fact that numerous chapters were co-written between mentors and mentees. Almost all of it was not about graduate students outside of LIS programs. But I thought it was sort of a wonderful demonstration of enacting the sort of mentorship that we've been talking about and that they were talking about in the book.
Okay, well, I know
to join the others in saying thank you for drawing a light to this subject. I really feel that mentorship is an underestimated aspect of building your library career. And I know I wouldn't be where I am today without my mentor in grad school. So I will be eternally grateful. And as we all are, I'm sure, for those of us who were lucky enough to have good mentors in our lives. So just wanted to say thank you as well.
And on the LibGuide, we didn't get into kind of mentoring across cultural divides as much as we would have liked to. I think maybe that's a separate presentation, but we have listed some resources for recognizing the importance of individual student identities, especially if they differ from your own. Yeah, thanks, Netta.
Yeah, it's true.
I know that we're on a tight schedule, so people might appreciate the 4-minute breather. So if there aren't other questions, I don't want to take over the moderator. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're fine. Yeah, you guys can have these 4 minutes back of your time. And if you're joining us for the next session, we'll see you at 3.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.